The roar of the crowd was deafening. Tens of thousands packed into the arena, lights flashing, cameras capturing every frantic heartbeat. And yet, the camera lingered on one man, sitting alone in the front row. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched the program, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his temple. He was older now, wrinkled, worn by years he hadn't expected to reach. But the memory that haunted him was sharp, unforgiving. Decades ago, in a small classroom in Tupelo, he had looked at a shy, freckled boy holding a guitar and said words he would never take back. "You'll never be a singer, son. Forget about it." And here he was, staring at that boy, no longer a boy, but a man who had become a legend, whose name had rewritten music itself. Every cheer from the arena seemed to mock him, yet it also carried a truth he could no longer escape. The man who once doubted, who had dismissed raw talent as foolishness, now faced the living proof of his own blindness. Somewhere in the thunder of applause, the line between regret and awe blurred. Tonight, the past had arrived in the brightest lights and the loudest voices, and nothing would ever be the same. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The classroom in Tupelo, Mississippi, smelled of chalk dust and polished wooden floors that had seen generations of children scuffing their shoes against them. Sunlight filtered weakly through the tall, narrow windows, illuminating the faint haze of dust in the air. Young Elvis clutched his small, worn guitar, its frets scratched from hours of practice, and sat on the edge of the stiff wooden bench, fingers trembling slightly. His mother's gentle voice echoed in his memory. "Sing for yourself, son." Not for them, but the school walls, stark and unforgiving, felt far away from home, and he was about to face a test he did not yet understand. The cruelty of the world in miniature form. Tabipars Hargrove, the music teacher, a man of broad shoulders and a severe frown, surveyed the classroom with a critical eye. His lips pressed tightly together, almost forming a permanent line of judgment, and his eyes, cold, precise, fixed on Elvis, as though he were a puzzle that would never fit. "All right, Presley," he said, voice slicing through the chatter of the other children. "Let's hear what you've got." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that presses down on a small boy's chest, making it hard to breathe. Elvis shifted, his fingers grazing the strings, producing a tentative note that wobbled like a bird learning to fly. Then he began to sing, a simple melody, humble yet filled with longing. For a brief moment, the music seemed to lift him above the low ceilings and the rows of desks. But the moment was shattered. Laughter erupted from the back of the room. Some children giggled nervously, others whispered cruel jokes. One boy, taller, with a smirk permanently etched on his face, muttered, "Nice try, but you'll never make it." Mr. Hargrove's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Elvis, you're never going to be a singer. You'd do better to focus on something real, something practical." The words hit him like stones thrown with precision. They were not just opinions. They were decrees, meant to seal the door of possibility forever. The boy's small chest tightened, his throat ached, and the warmth of his mother's encouragement seemed miles away, almost unreal. He felt something inside him break, an invisible wing folding against his ribs. After school, the ride home was quiet. The sun was low, casting golden streaks across the dusty roads of Tupelo. Gladys Presley's hands were warm on his shoulders when she greeted him at the door, her eyes clouded with worry. She listened silently as he muttered fragments of the day. Words caught in a lump in his throat. She led him to the living room, where the old upright piano stood against the wall, its surface worn from years of fingers tracing chords. "Sing for us, son," she said softly, her voice firm yet comforting. "It doesn't matter what they think. Your music is yours, and it's enough." Elvis lowered himself onto the piano bench, and for the first time that day, he let the music flow without self-consciousness, without the fear of judgment. Each note resonated through the small room, filling the corners with warmth, carrying away some of the sting from the classroom. The contrast was jarring, the cruelty of the school fading into the gentle sanctuary of home, where love and belief were the only audiences that mattered. That night, lying in his small bed, guitar at his side, he pressed the day's pain deep inside him. It was a wound he could not yet articulate, a shadow that would follow him quietly, shaping a drive that neither laughter nor dismissal could ever fully erase. The world outside was vast and indifferent, yet the seed of determination had been planted. The words of Mr. Hargrove, sharp and final, did not extinguish the flame. They fanned it in a different, more enduring way. From that day, every note he played, every melody he hummed quietly to himself, carried the echoes of both derision and love, a duality that would define the very essence of his path. And in the hush of the evening, as the crickets chirped outside and the Mississippi air cooled around the wooden house, young Elvis felt a quiet promise take root, a promise to sing, not for applause, not for recognition, but for the undeniable truth that music flowed from his soul, unstoppable and resilient, even in the face of those who could not yet see it. It was the first taste of a lifelong battle, the moment he learned that the world's doubt could either crush him or forge him into something greater. Every sneer, every dismissive word would become fuel, shaping a boy into a man who would one day hold stadiums in awe, not by erasing the pain, but by transforming it into art, into energy, into a story that belonged to him alone. And though he could not know it then, the echoes of that classroom, the sting of laughter and cold authority, would follow him across decades, through fame and fortune, until the day he confronted the past in a way that would leave the world, and one small, stubborn teacher, forever changed. The scent of cigarette smoke mixed with the faint tang of spilled soda and stage varnish. It clung to the dressing room walls like a stubborn memory, mingling with the sharp tang of perfume and hairspray from the chorus girls, their laughter bouncing off mirrors framed with electric lights. Elvis sat quietly in his worn velvet chair, the weight of 1,000,000 eyes yet to see him pressing invisibly against his chest. The roar of the crowd in the arena beyond the stage doors was a living thing, a tidal wave of anticipation and devotion that seemed impossible to contain. Yet beneath the surface of triumph, a familiar flicker of unease stirred, a memory that had never truly faded. It was strange how the mind worked. In the brief moments before stepping into the flood of lights and cheers, he saw the classroom in Tupelo again. He saw Mr. Hargrove's stern face, the echo of that cruel phrase, "You'll never be a singer." He remembered the snickering boys, their eyes sharp with mockery, and the suffocating sense of inadequacy that had once pressed so heavily on his chest. Fame and fortune had changed almost everything, but not the raw nerve of being told you were not enough. In the silence of the dressing room, Elvis allowed himself to feel it fully, letting the sting of rejection settle over him one last time, a ghost haunting the apex of his own success. A stagehand nudged him gently. "They're ready for you, boss." Elvis nodded, rising slowly, feeling the familiar thrill of performance tighten his chest and spark his nerves. But something else had entered his consciousness that day. Something small, but insistent. He had learned that Mr. Hargrove was still alive, living not far from Memphis, still capable of forming judgments about the boy he once dismissed. There were whispers, casual and careless, among the locals and friends in the music industry. "I knew that boy in school," someone had said. "He wasn't anything special." Funny how he turned out this way, isn't it? Elvis had laughed at first. The idea was absurd, almost comical. Yet beneath the laughter, there was a flicker of something more, an old, familiar ache, sharper now because it seemed trivial in comparison to his present triumph. That tiny, wounded boy from Tupelo, who had once trembled with uncertainty and shame, was still a part of him. He could not fully erase the sting of dismissal, the feeling of being underestimated by someone he had once wanted to impress above all others. That teacher's doubt had planted seeds of doubt in him, but it had also, perversely, created a fuel for resilience that no applause, no record sale, no glittering contract could replicate. The lights dimmed momentarily as the stage crew adjusted microphones and instruments. From the corridor outside, the muffled chants and screams of thousands grew louder, a living, breathing force. Elvis felt the familiar adrenaline surge, a jolt that made his pulse quicken. But the memory of Mr. Hargrove remained, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. He remembered the disapproval, the coldness, the public humiliation, and he realized, in that quiet prelude before stepping into the spotlight, that he was on the cusp of confronting more than an audience. He was on the edge of facing a fragment of his own history, a man who had underestimated him so completely, so thoroughly, that even decades later, the shadow remained. He stepped into the arena, and the roar hit him like a wave. Lights blazed down, illuminating thousands of faces, all expectant, all hungry for the show, for the magic of the king. Cameras flashed, capturing moments that would last forever in magazines, newspapers, and film reels. Yet, through the storm of adoration and devotion, his eyes searched for something else, an intangible shape among the sea of spectators. And then he saw him. Mr. Hargrove, older now, a weathered man with thinning hair and creased skin, sat in the front row. His posture was stiff, shoulders hunched, as though trying to hide from the realization of what he was seeing. The gaze that had once crushed a boy's spirit now rested on the man he had helped forge, whether knowingly or not. There was a moment when time itself seemed to hesitate, a beat where past and present collided, and the arena's frenzy faded into a hush that only Elvis could hear. For a fleeting heartbeat, anger surged, a flash of resentment at the teacher who had once cast him aside. But it was different now, seasoned with the years and tempered by triumph. There was curiosity, too, a strange desire to understand what had shaped a man who could look at him now and not recognize the fire he had once tried to extinguish. The irony was bitter and sweet. The very person who had dismissed him was witnessing in person the culmination of all the dreams that were once deemed impossible. And yet, Elvis knew this was only the beginning of the reckoning. The music, the lights, the cheers, these were the trappings of success. But the deeper moment awaited. The confrontation would not come through words, but through a presence, a shared glance, a recognition that the past had never truly left either of them. In that moment, before the first chord rang out, before the first scream of the crowd erupted in response to his voice, Elvis felt an electrifying mix of anticipation, memory, and quiet, simmering defiance. He had come full circle, and the stage would not only be for the audience, it would be for history itself, for the boy who had been laughed at in a classroom decades ago, and for the man who had refused to let that laughter define him. The first note pierced the charged air, sharp and unwavering, slicing through decades of doubt. Elvis sang, every word, every chord imbued with the memory of rejection and the quiet fortitude of a boy who had refused to surrender. And somewhere, beneath the roaring applause and flashing lights, Mr. Hargrove felt it too, the unmistakable echo of a talent he had dismissed, a power he had underestimated, and a life he had never imagined would unfold in such magnificent defiance. The world cheered, but for Elvis, the applause was secondary. This was not merely a performance, it was a reckoning, a subtle reclamation of a past wound, and the faintest whisper of a challenge yet to come. He had made it here, standing on the precipice of fame and history, but one truth lingered, relentless. The boy who had been told he could never sing was finally confronting the man who had planted the seed of doubt, and he intended to do it on his own terms. The stage lights dimmed for a brief moment, a collective inhalation from the crowd, as though the entire arena held its breath. Elvis, mid-performance, felt the vibrations of the hall through the soles of his boots, the familiar tremor of energy that had carried him from small clubs to stadiums, from hesitant melodies in Tupelo to global adoration. And yet, even amidst this almost sacred electricity, a singular presence jolted him like a chord struck out of tune. He had seen faces in crowds before, fans waving, screaming, holding signs with his name in bold letters, pleading for attention, for a moment of recognition. But this was different. In the first row, a man sat slouched, older, his hair silvering at the temples, his posture unyielding but his expression etched with a mixture of disbelief and unease. Elvis froze for a heartbeat, the microphone quivering lightly in his grip. Recognition hit him like a bolt. It was Mr. Hargrove, the same teacher who had crushed the small, hopeful boy in Tupelo decades earlier. Time seemed to distort. The screaming fans, the lights, the instruments, they all receded into a soft blur. Elvis saw the classroom again, the harsh fluorescent light, the rasp of chalk against the blackboard, the chorus of laughter as his young voice cracked and faltered under ridicule. And now, here, in the heart of his triumph, that same man's eyes were fixed upon him, wide and unflinching, almost as if seeking to measure how far the boy he had dismissed had traveled. The paradox was dizzying. He felt anger flare, immediate and hot, a reflexive recoil against the injustice of that moment, now magnified in its retrospective cruelty. But it was tempered quickly by a deeper, more complex emotion. Curiosity. How had life shaped this man? What had he become? This person who had once seemed invincible in his authority to belittle. And, more quietly, a strange sense of pity emerged, a recognition that Hargrove's disapproval had been a reflection of his own fears and limitations, not a measure of the boy's worth. The music played on, Elvis's fingers dancing across the strings, voice filling the cavernous space with a magnetic energy that could silence storms. Yet each note was underscored by the memory of rejection. It was as if every chord, every harmonized line, carried a private defiance meant only for the man who had once doubted him. And while the audience erupted in ecstasy at the spectacle, Elvis's eyes remained locked on that single, unmoving figure, reading the quiet shifts of expression that flickered across his face. Hargrove's lips moved slightly, a whisper or perhaps a silent apology, the words lost beneath the roar of the arena. There was no malice now, only astonishment, the kind that comes when someone is confronted with the undeniable proof of a truth they had tried to ignore. The man had aged, certainly. Wrinkles mapped decades of worry and routine, His suit, neat and conservative, hinted at a life lived cautiously, meticulously, without the unpredictability that had defined Elvis's journey. And yet, in those eyes, the same sharp, analytical gaze remained. The gaze that had once dissected a boy's potential and found it lacking. In that split second, Elvis made a choice, a quiet, deliberate decision that would shape the evening, the narrative of his life, and perhaps even the legacy of the man before him. He would not let the past manifest as anger or petty revenge. There would be no public humiliation, no sharp words delivered in the heat of spotlighted vindication. Instead, he would confront this chapter with the subtle, undeniable power that had fueled his career. The demonstration of truth, of achievement, of integrity. The audience sensed a change in the rhythm. Even the musicians, seasoned professionals, felt the pause in his performance, the slight hesitation that made the next chord feel monumental. Elvis's voice softened as he sang, the lyrics taking on a weight they had not carried before, almost conversational, intimate, despite the scale of the venue. Each note, each gesture was calibrated not for spectacle but for connection, for an unspoken conversation with the man sitting in the first row. It was the kind of energy that could not be rehearsed or faked. It existed only in raw, lived experience, forged from years of resilience and reflection. For Hargrove, the effect was immediate and visceral. The certainty that had once anchored his judgment wavered. He saw not a superstar, not an icon adorned in glitter and lights, but the boy who had once stumbled, the same voice he had dismissed with casual cruelty. The realization cut sharply. He had underestimated the boy's spirit, the boy's resolve, and in that moment the past demanded acknowledgement. Yet he remained silent, unsure how to reconcile decades of belief with the undeniable presence of success standing mere feet away. And in that silence, in the thick electric air between them, Elvis sensed the full arc of his own journey. The fear, the doubt, the relentless drive that had propelled him from tiny homes in Tupelo to packed arenas now converged in this precise moment. The stage was no longer merely a platform for performance. It was a bridge between past and present, a medium for unspoken confrontation, for resolution that transcended anger and entered the realm of understanding. The crowd roared again, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding at its heart, but Elvis felt it acutely. A tension, a recognition, a challenge accepted and elevated beyond the realm of petty emotions. He continued to sing, to move with a fluid grace honed by years of discipline and instinct, but every gesture, every glance carried the weight of that singular connection. And though no one else could see the dialogue, the exchange was unmistakable. A boy wronged, a man redeemed, history reconciled through the quiet insistence of presence, achievement, and silent dignity. For a moment, he allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile, a private acknowledgement that the stage could be more than applause and spectacle. It could be justice, not in the form of vengeance, but in the affirmation of self, in the demonstration that triumph was not merely about recognition, but about enduring, persisting, and confronting the past with grace. And as the song ended, the final notes fading into the collective roar of the audience, Elvis held his gaze just a fraction longer. Mr. Hargrove's eyes met his fully now, a flicker of something unspoken, a tremor in the armor of certainty, the quiet acknowledgement of a life lesson finally realized. The moment was fleeting, but it planted the seeds for what was to come, a reckoning that would unfold not with shouts or conflict, but through the subtle, transformative power of human connection. The final chord reverberated through the arena, a wave of sound that lingered in the air like a pulse, vibrating in the ribs of every fan. For a heartbeat, the hall erupted in cheers, screams, and applause, the kind of wild, unrelenting energy that had come to define Elvis's performances. But then, unexpectedly, he let the silence settle. The microphone was still in his hand, the spotlight centered on him, and he did not move. He let the music die completely, the drum beats and guitar riffs dissolving into nothing. The crowd blinked, unsure. A ripple of murmurs moved across the audience, a question in the air heavier than any note could carry. Why had he stopped? Some thought it was part of the act. Some feared a technical issue, but most simply waited, captivated by the strange, tense quiet. Elvis's eyes scanned the arena, taking in the vast, writhing sea of faces. Yet they always returned to that one figure in the front row. Mr. Hargrove's presence felt magnified in the stillness. The man looked smaller now, not because he had changed physically, but because the weight of recognition and memory pressed upon him. Every line of his face seemed sharper, every gesture measured, as though decades of authority and certainty were unraveling in real time. Elvis cleared his throat, the low sound cutting through the murmur of the audience. His voice, when it came, was softer than the roaring halls usually demanded, carrying a quiet gravity that instantly commanded attention. "There was a boy once," he began, and the words seemed to hang in the air, strange and fragile against the energy of thousands. A boy who wanted to sing and was told he could never do it, that someone smarter, stronger, older, knew better. A hush descended. The audience leaned in, sensing that this was no ordinary interlude. The usual expectation of performance had shifted. They were witnessing something intimate and raw. Elvis's fingers rested lightly on the microphone, as if waiting for each word to resonate fully, not just for the crowd, but for the one man who had shaped the very fear he had carried for so long. The memory of that classroom returned, sharp and vivid. The harsh, fluorescent lights, the smirk on the teacher's face, the laughter of children echoing like a cold wind across the years. It had been a moment that cut him deep, that lodged in his chest and whispered doubts at nights when the road ahead seemed impossible. And now, decades later, he held the power to transform that memory into something more than pain. Elvis's voice took on a melodic cadence, blending the narrative with the music, though the instruments remained silent behind him. "We all meet people who doubt us," he said, eyes fixed on Mr. Hargrove, "some who laugh, some who say we're dreaming too big, some who tell us, without meaning to be cruel, that we're not meant for our dreams." He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in, not only for the audience, but for the man who had once been his judge. The teacher's lips pressed together, the faint tremor of guilt, or perhaps surprise, visible in the corner of his mouth. His hand clenched at his side, betraying the conflict within. For decades, he had measured his own judgment as just, certain, perhaps even righteous. And now, here it was, stripped bare by the person he had doubted most profoundly. Elvis continued, his voice richer now, textured with the depth of lived experience. But that boy didn't stop. He sang when he was told not to. He sang when the world laughed. And every note, every word, every step. It was a testament not to their judgment, but to the fire they couldn't put out. The crowd was silent, almost reverential. The usual frenzy of applause had stilled into something almost sacred. People felt the intimacy of the moment, even in the cavernous space of the arena. Some clutched each other's hands, others stared, mouths slightly open, as if unsure whether to cheer or to absorb the gravity of what they were witnessing. Elvis's gaze softened, and the tension in his own chest eased. He felt the culmination of years of struggle, doubt, triumph, and perseverance crystallize in this singular pause. "I'm not here to shame anyone," he said, his voice firm yet gentle, "but I am here to say, never let someone else's doubt decide who you are. Never let it silence your voice. Sing, even if the world tells you it cannot be done." A flicker passed over Mr. Hargrove's face, recognition, shame, awe. He was no longer merely a spectator. He was a participant in the reckoning, the subtle, transformative act that Elvis was orchestrating without spectacle or revenge. The years of power and dismissal had collapsed into a single, undeniable truth. The boy had endured, and the man had witnessed it. Elvis held the gaze just a moment longer before allowing a faint smile to break across his face. The first note of the next song hesitated in the silence as though waiting for permission. And then, with deliberate fluidity, he played it, letting the music rise around them, intertwining triumph with reflection. The audience erupted, but the sound was now layered, rich with understanding. Some screamed, some clapped, but all were colored by the raw emotion of having watched a man confront the echoes of his own past in real time. And for Elvis, this pause, the silence, the story, the confrontation, was more powerful than any encore, more resonant than any standing ovation. It was the affirmation of a journey, of a spirit unbroken, of the quiet strength that comes not from fame or applause, but from the courage to face your history and transform it into light. Hargrove remained frozen in place, a man undone by decades of assumption and rigidity, and yet subtly reshaped by witnessing the grace of a life lived fully, without bitterness, without revenge, only purpose. And for the first time, he understood that the lesson he had once denied in a classroom of children was now being taught to thousands, not with words of condemnation, but with the lived truth of resilience and triumph. The arena was a sea of faces, still caught between the echo of the last note and the words that had just fallen from Elvis's lips. The lights danced softly over the crowd, the haze of smoke and the faint glitter from sequined outfits creating a surreal, almost sacred atmosphere. The audience, hungry for spectacle, expected the next song, the next gyration, the next lightning-fast burst of charisma. But Elvis did not move. He did not strum the guitar, did not nod to the band. His voice, carrying over the lingering hum of anticipation, cut through the tension like a knife wrapped in silk. "I want to tell you something," he began, his gaze fixed on the old man in the first row. "Mr. Hargrove." The spotlight hit the teacher directly, illuminating the contours of age and regret that had softened his once authoritative demeanor. Not about fame, not about music, but about life and about courage. The audience leaned in, sensing the intimacy, the gravity. This wasn't performance. It was confession, revelation, and invitation all at once. A single microphone, a stage, and tens of thousands of hearts listening. Elvis inhaled deeply, the familiar scent of the stage lights, sweat, and the faint tang of cheap beer from the balcony mingling into a memory of decades-long struggle. "You see," he continued, voice gentle but unwavering, "there was a time when someone told me I couldn't. Someone said I would never be a singer, a performer, someone who could touch the hearts of people I'd never meet. I was just a boy, scared, uncertain, filled with hope I didn't even know how to carry." His eyes softened, a flicker of boyhood vulnerability breaking through the rock and roll icon, and I almost let it stop me. The crowd remained quiet, mesmerized. Some whispered to neighbors, unsure if they should cheer or remain reverent. Others clutched their programs, feeling the weight of a story that was now more universal than a concert. It was a lesson whispered to every person who had ever been doubted. "But here's the thing," Elvis said, the smile forming on his lips gentle but electric. "When someone doubts you, it isn't always an enemy. Sometimes it's a mirror of what you need to prove, not to them, but to yourself. Every time someone told me I wasn't enough, every laugh, every shake of the head, every cruel word, they became the fuel I needed to rise." Mr. Hargrove's posture shifted. He had not expected this. For decades, he had clung to a version of himself that justified his harsh words. But the gaze of the man he had once dismissed, the boy he had laughed at, was now radiant with triumph, not anger. The power dynamic had inverted in the most profound way possible. "I want you all to hear this," Elvis said, voice rising slightly, ringing with authority now that had been tempered by understanding. "Don't measure your worth by those who doubt you. Don't measure your courage by the applause of the crowd. Measure it by whether you get up again after they tell you no. Measure it by whether you keep singing, even when they think your voice isn't worth hearing." The audience responded instinctively, a collective shiver running through the hall. Applause began softly, then swelled into a rolling tide. But Elvis's attention remained fixed on that first row. He didn't need the approval of the masses in this moment. The lesson was for one person who had once defined his fears. "You think this is revenge?" he said quietly, allowing just a shadow of irony to brush the words. "No, this isn't about making someone pay. It's about showing that kindness, perseverance, and dignity can rise higher than any grudge, any slight, any doubt ever cast." The applause now roared, rising in waves, but the words had already settled into the hearts of the audience. Standing ovations came, but they were not for a song alone. They were for the embodiment of resilience, for the act of taking a childhood wound and transforming it into wisdom and grace. Mr. Hargrove's eyes glistened, a tear carving a path down a weathered cheek. He had expected humiliation, a chance to witness payback, but what unfolded was something far more disarming. Forgiveness and recognition without demand. For the first time, the old teacher felt the weight of his words, decades of judgment, and yet instead of shame or retreat, there was something else. The quiet power of redemption witnessed. Elvis reached forward slightly, almost imperceptibly, closing the invisible gap between the past and the present. "To the boy I once was, to the man I once feared I would never become, and to anyone listening tonight," he said, letting the words linger like the final note of a lullaby, "your strength is yours alone. Nurture it, celebrate it, and never let anyone take it from you." The crowd rose, some on their feet, some still kneeling in quiet awe, clapping with genuine reverence. The energy had shifted. It was no longer only music that bound them, but the human truth of perseverance, of forgiveness, of living without bitterness. Mr. Hargrove, still in that first row, now understood that the lesson he had once denied in a small classroom had been reclaimed not with confrontation, but with compassion. Elvis stepped back slightly, allowing the next song to rise organically, but the moment lingered, suspended, like a photograph of courage and grace. He had not needed to exact revenge. He had transcended the role of victim and victor simultaneously, teaching the audience and his former teacher what real strength truly looked like. And for the first time in decades, Mr. Hargrove felt seen not as a figure of authority, but as a man capable of understanding, capable of witnessing, and perhaps capable of change. The arena's applause continued to swell, but for Elvis, The victory was quiet, internal, profound. He had turned old wounds into a beacon for others, and in that quiet triumph, he reclaimed not just the stage, but the story of his life in its entirety. The arena pulsed with energy, a living entity of anticipation and adoration. The echo of applause from the previous lesson of perseverance still lingered like a soft hum in the cavernous hall. Fans waved their hands, shouting for the next song, the next move, yet Elvis remained rooted at center stage. His guitar rested gently against him, unplayed, a silent witness to the climax of a story no one in the crowd could fully comprehend. In that instant, time seemed to slow, each breath, each heartbeat magnified under the glaring lights. Then, without a word, Elvis took a step toward the edge of the stage, eyes fixed on the first row. Mr. Hargrove, the man whose words had once threatened to crush a small boy's dream, was still seated, rigid with disbelief and hesitation. His hands fidgeted nervously, clutching the armrests of his chair as if grounding himself against a tidal wave he had never expected. The crowd, sensing a shift but unaware of the context, began to murmur, a ripple of curiosity and confusion moving like a current through the arena. Elvis lifted his hand slowly, a gesture both intimate and commanding. "Come with me," he said, his voice carrying with gentle authority. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of decades, of pain transformed into understanding, of reconciliation beyond public spectacle. A hush fell over the audience. Some thought it a joke, some suspected a staged stunt, but no one guessed the truth. The invitation was profoundly personal, a bridge across a lifetime of doubt and regret. Mr. Hargrove's brow furrowed. The old rigidity of a man defined by rules and judgment battled with something deeper, something unexpected. The possibility of witnessing, of participating in a moment far larger than himself. He opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to decline, but the sincerity in Elvis's eyes was undeniable. With a tentative, almost trembling motion, he rose, taking one step at a time, feeling the weight of each movement, not just physically, but emotionally, like crossing a chasm he had never dared to approach. The audience, witnessing the slow, almost sacred procession, erupted into a stunned hush that soon gave way to an explosion of cheers. Camera flashes painted strobe-like patterns across the hall, yet amidst the spectacle, a profound stillness lingered. Here was no performance, no choreography, just two men, one once doubted and the other doubter, standing at the precipice of a shared human truth. Elvis extended his hand fully, bridging the gap between stage and chair, past and present, hurt and forgiveness. "You are part of this story too," he said, voice low but unwavering. "You helped shape it, even when you didn't know it." The words, spoken with gentle power, reverberated through the arena, more potent than any melody or lyric ever could. Mr. Hargrove's hands hovered over Elvis's, uncertain, almost afraid to touch the moment. But then, slowly, deliberately, he placed his palm into Elvis's. The contact was electric yet tender, a physical acknowledgement of reconciliation that resonated far beyond the stage. The audience's reaction was instantaneous, a deafening roar of approval, but layered beneath it was something rarer, a shared recognition of humanity at its most vulnerable and transcendent. Elvis guided him a few steps onto the stage, positioning him near the spotlight, where for a brief moment the entire arena's attention shifted from music to presence. The lights illuminated the old man. Every wrinkle, every line, every shadow of age and remorse made visible, yet softened by the glow of understanding and the courage it had taken to step forward. The band, sensing the gravity, held their instruments in quiet solidarity, no note intruding on the sacred tension. Elvis spoke again, softly, almost to himself, yet loud enough for those closest to hear. It's never too late to be part of something bigger than yourself. The audience hung on every word, feeling the weight and significance of a moment that would be etched into memory far beyond the echo of any song. For Mr. Hargrove, it was dizzying, disorienting, almost unreal. He had imagined confrontation, humiliation, even revenge. But this was grace in its purest form. Standing beside the man he had once judged so harshly, he realized that true power was not in authority or criticism, but in witnessing and being witnessed, in accepting the ripple effects of actions long past, and in allowing space for someone else's triumph to be shared rather than diminished. Elvis turned slightly toward the audience, his arm still around the older man's shoulder, a symbolic gesture of unity and transcendence. The arena erupted once more, not just for the king of rock and roll, but for the humanity of the act. Here, there was no rivalry, no bitterness, no victory over another person, only the triumph of empathy, courage, and reconciliation. The applause carried the story far beyond the concert hall, echoing through the ages like the faint reverberation of a chord struck perfectly, resonating in hearts and memories alike. And for Elvis, as he stepped back to allow Mr. Hargrove a place in the light, the victory was private, intimate, a reaffirmation of the journey he had traversed from a shy boy in Tupelo to a man capable of showing the world that forgiveness could be more electrifying than revenge, and more enduring than fame. For Mr. Hargrove, the standing ovation was more than spectacle. It was recognition of the courage it took to admit past errors, to embrace vulnerability, and to witness the beauty of a life fully lived despite, and sometimes because of, mistakes made along the way. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that the boy he had dismissed had not only survived, but had thrived, and had chosen to extend a hand where others might have sought retribution. And in that moment, under the blinding lights, amid the roar of thousands, two men, once separated by years of judgment and doubt, stood together, not as adversaries, but as living proof that the past need not define the present, and that the courage to forgive could transform the stage of life itself into something far more profound than music alone. The arena, still trembling from the previous eruption of applause, now held a different tension, a quiet, intimate suspense that seemed almost sacred. Thousands of fans leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding beyond any ordinary performance. Elvis stood with Mr. Hargrove, his arm still lightly resting on the old teacher's shoulder, the stage lights casting long, soft shadows behind them. Every face in the crowd was a blur, every cheer a distant echo. For the two men, it was as though the world had shrunk to the space between them. Mr. Hargrove's hands shook slightly, not from age alone, but from the weight of the moment. He had never imagined himself standing on a stage like this, the boy he had once dismissed towering beside him, vibrant, triumphant, unbroken. The heat of the spotlights pressed against his skin, mingling with the cold flash of self-realization. Here, before thousands, he had to confront not just the past, but the impact of every word he had spoken, every doubt he had sown. Elvis, sensing the hesitation, leaned closer. His voice was quiet, carrying more compassion than command. "It's okay," he said, almost tenderly. "You don't have to say anything you're not ready for. Just be here. That's enough." The simplicity of the statement held immense power. It absolved and encouraged at the same time. The old man nodded slowly, swallowing hard, then lifted the microphone, his fingers trembling against the metal. His voice came out at first weak, a fragile thread of sound barely audible over the soft rustle of anticipation. I never thought I would." He paused, gathering courage. "I never believed you could do it. I thought the world would be too hard on you. I thought you'd break." A hush fell over the crowd, a collective inhalation of empathy and curiosity. They did not yet know the full story, but they could feel the gravity, the raw honesty vibrating through the arena. Each word the teacher spoke was not a confession of guilt in the ordinary sense, but a recognition of the journey, a tribute to resilience and courage. Elvis squeezed his shoulder gently, a silent reassurance. "You were wrong," he said, smiling warmly, "but that's okay. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do next." His eyes met the teacher's, and for a heartbeat, no sound existed except the shared understanding between two people, years and life experiences collapsing into a single, profound moment. Mr. Hargrove swallowed again, tears glistening at the corners of his eyes, and for the first time he allowed himself to see the boy he had once doubted, not as a figure of defiance or reproach, but as a man who had triumphed, not by punishing, not by vengeance, but by living fully, unbroken, and offering grace. He found the courage to continue, his voice steadier now. "You showed me what I couldn't see. That believing, even when I did not, can create more strength than I imagined." The audience erupted, not in the frantic frenzy of rock star adoration, but in a standing ovation of acknowledgement, a shared recognition of human vulnerability and triumph. People were crying, laughing, clapping, their emotions raw and sincere. Cameras captured the moment, but none could truly convey the depth, the intimacy, the rare alchemy of contrition met with compassion. Elvis turned slightly to the crowd, his arm still around Mr. Hargrove, and spoke softly, intentionally, so the words carried both to the teacher and to every person in the arena. "Life will test you. People will doubt you. And sometimes, even those you love may not see your worth. But every setback, every word of disbelief, it is not a wall to stop you. It is the fire that proves what you are capable of." Mr. Hargrove, moved beyond words, nodded. His eyes reflected the bright stage lights, the weight of the past, and the hope of redemption. He understood finally that this was not a moment of punishment, not a spectacle of humiliation, but a shared lesson in courage and empathy. The crowd, sensing the closure, gave another deafening ovation, their applause washing over the two men like a tide. The cheers were loud, but amidst the chaos, the stage held a quiet truth: that life's victories were not measured in trophies or fame, but in the courage to confront the past, to forgive, and to recognize the strength in others, even in those we once misjudged. Elvis stepped back slightly, giving the teacher the spotlight for an instant longer, a symbolic gesture of trust and respect. Mr. Hargrove inhaled deeply, soaking in the moment, allowing himself to be celebrated not for what he had done, but for what he was now, transformed by humility, by acknowledgement, and by the grace extended to him. The lights dimmed slightly, the music softening in the background, yet the aura of the moment lingered, electric and profound. In those few minutes, the arena witnessed more than a reunion. They witnessed the alchemy of forgiveness, the quiet, enduring power of human connection, and the proof that even the most unlikely of bridges, built from the shards of past mistakes, could hold the weight of triumph. As the audience continued their applause, Elvis leaned close to Mr. Hargrove one last time, whispering so only he could hear, We are both part of this story now. That will never change." The old man nodded, tears streaming freely, understanding fully that he had not just observed history, he had stepped into it, changed by the very boy he once underestimated. And in that arena, lit by stage lights and the sincerity of human reconciliation, the world witnessed a truth more powerful than any song. The courage to forgive, to acknowledge mistakes, and to embrace the humanity in another, even decades later, was the true measure of greatness. The backstage corridors were a stark contrast to the roaring arena. The walls, lined with posters of past performances and faded photographs, carried the faint scent of polish and decades of sweat and perfume. The hum of distant voices from the crowd seeped through the heavy curtains, but inside this narrow passageway, the world felt paused, intimate, almost sacred. Elvis led Mr. Hargrove through the maze of equipment and instruments, the sound of his own heartbeat, a quiet echo in the near silence. Mr. Hargrove's steps were hesitant. Each movement seemed weighted by the years, by memory, and by the improbable twist of fate that had led him from judgment to recognition. He finally paused near a worn dressing-room door, resting a hand against the wall, as though seeking some support to steady himself. The air smelled faintly of cologne, sweat, and the subtle musky perfume of stage curtains, a sensory reminder of a world that had once seemed distant and unreachable to him. Elvis motioned toward a small seating area, its furniture simple but functional, the kind of backstage practicality that contrasted sharply with the glamour outside. He gestured for the old man to sit. "Take a breath," he said softly. "You don't have to perform anymore. Not here. This is just us." His tone carried the warmth and patience of someone who had long learned to temper his own success with empathy for others. Mr. Hargrove sank into the chair, rubbing his hands over his face. "I watched you. All those years," he began slowly, voice uneven. "From Tupelo to Memphis to here, I saw the world try to push you down, try to mold you into what it thought you should be. And I was part of that. I doubted you, and in doing so, I carried my own fear of failure into your life. I never wanted to break you, but I was afraid the world would. I never imagined you'd survive it. And then, you didn't just survive, you thrived." Elvis listened quietly, letting the words settle in the space between them. He could feel the genuine weight behind them, the long suppressed guilt, and the human fragility that had never changed, even as the years had added wrinkles and graying hair. "You doubted me?" Elvis replied, his voice calm, almost reflective. "And maybe in some way, that doubt gave me a kind of fire. A reason to prove something, not to you necessarily, but to myself. I needed to show that the voice inside me was real, that the dreams I held weren't foolish. Your disbelief. It became part of my fuel." Mr. Hargrove exhaled slowly, his eyes moist. "I never realized that my words would leave such a mark. I thought my opinion was just one among many, and yet, I see now how profoundly they shaped you. You turned what I thought was weakness into your strength. I can't explain how proud I am, how amazed I am, how much I wish I could go back and do it differently. But maybe this moment now is the closest I'll ever get." Elvis leaned back, considering the weight of forgiveness, of understanding, of recognition. "It's not about changing the past," he said gently. "It's about what we do after. You didn't believe in me then. That's true. But here we are, and you're seeing what was always possible. That counts for something. It's never too late to witness a dream fully realized, even if you were skeptical at first." The old man swallowed hard, nodding, and a small, rueful smile appeared. I think I needed to see that. Not for me, but to understand how a person can endure, how they can rise above not just the world, but the voices closest to them. He paused, a distant look in his eyes, as though replaying decades of memory. You gave me a lesson I never expected to learn, about courage, persistence, and grace. Elvis leaned forward slightly, reaching into a nearby drawer and pulling out a small, simple envelope. I want you to have this, he said, placing it carefully in Mr. Hargrove's hands. The teacher opened it slowly, revealing a stack of tickets, each one marked for an upcoming performance, stretching across months. The gesture was simple but profound, a symbolic invitation, a recognition that their shared story was ongoing, not confined to the past. You'll come, Elvis said softly, not as a critic, not as a witness to my fame, but as someone who's been part of the story. I want you to see it all, every triumph, every song, every moment, not for the applause, but to know that what we carry inside, our fears, our doubts, our hopes, can transform us if we let it. Tears spilled freely from the old man's eyes, a mix of relief, remorse, and awe. He placed a hand over the tickets, gripping them tightly. I can't imagine. This is more than I ever hoped for. You're offering me a chance to witness not just your music, but your life. To learn, to see, to understand. I don't know what to say. Elvis smiled, that unmistakable warmth radiating from him. You don't have to say anything, he said. Just come. Be part of it. That's enough. The backstage air, heavy with decades of memory, reverence, and human connection, seemed to vibrate with quiet triumph. For a moment, the noise of the arena outside became irrelevant. Here, in this narrow, dimly lit passageway, two lives, intertwined by past mistakes, lessons, and an improbable journey, shared a profound truth: that human connection, acknowledgement, and grace could transform even decades of doubt into something enduring, luminous, and deeply hopeful. As Mr. Hargrove looked at the tickets again, his hands steady for the first time in years, he realized that he wasn't just witnessing history. He was becoming part of it, not as a critic, but as someone who had learned the extraordinary power of redemption and recognition. And in that quiet backstage corridor, the echoes of applause, distant yet resonant, reminded them both: greatness is not measured by the cheers of a crowd, but by the courage to face the past, to forgive, and to embrace the journey fully, even decades later. The morning after the concert was drenched in sunlight, golden and unrelenting, slipping into every corner of Memphis. Newspapers, glossy and ink-stained, bore headlines that no one had anticipated. Not about the set list, not about the record-breaking audience, but about a single human gesture that had transcended fame. Elvis invites, teacher to stage, a lesson in forgiveness. One headline read, the words carrying a weight that echoed far beyond the city. Across small towns and sprawling suburbs, radio commentators and newspaper editors alike replayed the story, capturing it not just as a note of celebrity eccentricity, but as a profound statement on human connection. Inside his modest house in Tupelo, Mr. Hargrove sat at the kitchen table, the morning light catching the fine lines of his face, the same face that had once judged a boy so harshly. He held the newspaper in his hands like a relic, the pages crinkling softly beneath his fingers. The words seemed surreal, distant almost, yet undeniably real. For the first time in decades, he felt the quiet pride of someone who had witnessed greatness, not from a distance, not as a skeptic, but as someone who had been woven, however inadvertently, into the very fabric of that triumph. He poured a cup of coffee, its bitter aroma grounding him in the moment. As he sipped, his mind traced the journey from that small classroom in Tupelo to the blinding lights of Las Vegas, to the storm of applause that had carried him and Elvis both through an evening of revelations. The memory of standing on that stage, heart-pounding, not as a critic but as a participant in something larger than himself, lingered like a delicate echo. He thought of the hand extended, the smile, the unspoken acknowledgement that forgiveness could coexist with humility, that recognition could transcend guilt. Meanwhile, across the city, Elvis read the press coverage in his private office, a quiet smile playing across his lips. He remembered the faces in the audience, the roar of thousands blending with the intimate connection of two lives intersecting. Fame, he knew, was transient. Applause faded. But the human moments, the moments of honesty, of vulnerability, of shared understanding, lasted far longer than any chart-topping single. They left imprints on hearts. They rewired perceptions. They offered a glimpse of something rare and unshakable. Grace. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Hargrove attended more of Elvis's performances. Each show, each standing ovation, reminded him not just of the music, but of the journey that had brought them together. He began to speak differently to former colleagues, to neighbors, to anyone willing to listen, sharing not the story of a boy who became a star, but the story of a man who had chosen to forgive, to elevate, and to include even those who had doubted him. In quiet moments, he would recall his own fear, how he had once equated disbelief with caution, and how profoundly wrong he had been. Now, he spoke instead of encouragement, of understanding, of the subtle, often overlooked power of human kindness. For Elvis, the moment remained quietly monumental. He often reflected, especially in the silence before a performance, on the fragility of hope and the resilience of the human spirit. That night on stage, inviting Mr. Hargrove into the light had not been a triumph over anyone else. It had been a triumph over fear, over resentment, over the narrow confines of expectation. He realized that music itself was only one medium, one vehicle for expression. The deeper victory lay in the connections forged, in the courage to acknowledge those who had shaped you, for better or worse, and to honor their part in the story without bitterness. The press, over the following months, chronicled the tale not as sensationalism, but as inspiration. Interviews highlighted Elvis's remarks. Music is not about being better than someone else. It's about finding the courage to be better than you were yesterday. It's the victory within yourself. These words resonated across generations, not merely as quotes, but as guiding principles. Teachers and students, parents and children, strangers reading the story in cafes or waiting rooms felt a spark ignite. An understanding that greatness did not lie solely in talent or recognition, but in integrity, empathy, and the ability to embrace one's past without shame. In his quiet home, Mr. Hargrove framed a single photograph from that night. Elvis, smiling warmly, hand on his shoulder, 1,000 faces cheering in the background. Beneath it he wrote, in careful, deliberate script, "Forgiveness is the stage on which we truly shine." The photograph hung above the mantel, a constant reminder that life's richest moments were not merely about achieving one's dreams, but about bridging gaps, healing wounds, and honoring the humanity in others. Elvis continued to perform, his career marked by sold-out arenas and worldwide acclaim. Yet for him, the apex of his legacy was never the trophies, the gold records, or the fanfare. It was the human connection, the quiet, electric pulse of authenticity, courage, and reconciliation. And for Mr. Hargrove, the story of that night transformed him. He became not the teacher who had doubted, but the man who had witnessed the power of belief. The man who had learned to see greatness not as a distant spectacle, but as something intimate, lived, and profoundly personal. Decades later, when the tale was recounted by journalists, historians, and fans alike, the essence remained clear. It was not a story of celebrity, nor a tale of revenge or retribution. It was a story of life, of courage, of choice, of how a boy who was told he would never sing could rise, not just to stardom, but to exemplify the human capacity for compassion. And in the quiet reflection of those who read, watched, or remembered, one truth resonated above all else. The brightest victories are those shared, not seized. The deepest triumphs are those that heal, rather than harm. Elvis, in an interview years later, captured it perfectly. Music is not a battle. It's a journey. And the real song is the one we sing to ourselves, about who we are, who we've become, and how we choose to honor every step of the path, even the painful ones. The words lingered long after the applause had faded, leaving behind a legacy not just of a performer, but of a man who showed the world that forgiveness, courage, and empathy could echo louder than any stage or spotlight ever could.